Okay, all right, we're back. So it's a little bit late, and came up with a kind of very strange robot here. So bear with me. So this robot is inspired by the fact that it's April Fool's today. So the idea behind this robot is it'll be a robot that's going to prank your friend or family member. So here's our robot. Here's friend or family member that we want to prank. And our sensor in this case is going to be a microphone. All right. Okay, so we could just imagine for simplicity that the microphone is going to measure some volume V. All right, so it's going to measure a single number. Of course, we know that microphones can measure a bunch of different numbers or very quickly they can measure different numbers at different points in time. But let's just imagine it measures a volume, and then we can think of this as a water cannon. Why not? All right, and then let's give this a symbol of W, and this will be volume of water fired from the cannon. Okay, so the idea here is how do we actually think about programming this robot as a sensory motor mapping? All right, so let's think about drawing that diagram again. So we have a little circle here called the environment. All right, so the environment is going to be sort of anything in the world. It could even include the robot itself. So think of that as like your friend, the sort of room that the robot is situated in, sort of anything that you need to consider in order to understand how the robot would function. The environment is going to generate some sort of sensory information. Here, let's think about that as VT. So it's going to be the volume level at time t. All right, and that's going to feed into sort of a box here, which we'll call our sensory motor mapping. All right, and then the output of that is going to be WT plus 1. All right, so the input was the volume at time t, the output is the water level at time t plus 1. And we're going to imagine that's going to feed back into the environment like this. All right, so of course, the actions that robots can take are going to have some sort of effect in the world. This one, maybe there'll be a pretty big effect. So then we might say, all right, well, the behavior that we'd like to have is that we want the robot to sort of hang out right in front of the door, wait for your friend to get home. And then when your friend comes in and says hi, you want the robot to be able to detect that and shoot your friend with the water cannon. All right, so when we say sensory motor mapping, all we really mean is a function. So we have our sensory information on the x-axis. This is going to be VT, so volume level. All right, and then the y-axis is going to be WT plus 1. You could say is the water level. All right, and then we'd have to know something about like what would the typical volume we would measure when your friend comes in the door. All right, so we probably wouldn't want this robot to be firing water all day while your friend's not there. So you might have some sort of value. This would be some sort of threshold level of sound when your friend is in the house. All right, and for our mapping, we might imagine when the volume is lower than that, we want your robot to sort of do nothing. And then when it gets to that level, we would sort of ramp up to our sort of maximum level. All right, this would be max power. All right, so kind of a silly example, but we could sort of think through what this kind of robot would do. If you wanted to make it more complicated, you could imagine we have like a wheel here. We could imagine having the robot try to steer towards loud sound and how you would represent that as a sensory motor mapping. We're going to be getting into that shortly as we jump into the rest of the assignment. Okay, so again, this is just another thing kind of to warm up and have fun. All right, cool. Sounds good. So again, that was 30.2, just one way you could go through that. All right, so now we want to get a little bit more concrete about the idea of sensory motor mapping. So there was some really fascinating work by Gray Walter. I believe this is in 1948 or 1949. So this is very old, but he was able to make some really amazing robots that did pretty amazing things autonomously with very simple techniques. So this is all sort of analog electronics. And the reason that these robots are able to do such interesting things is that a fairly simple sensory motor mapping can actually lead to pretty interesting behavior. So I'm gonna play the video of that so y'all can see what that's about.
In a simple villa on the outskirts of Bristol lives Dr. Gray Walter, a neurologist, who makes robots as a hobby. They are small, and he doesn't dress them up to look like men. He calls them tortoises, and so cunningly have their insides been designed that they respond to the stimuli of light and touch in a completely lifelike manner. This model is named Elsie, and she sees out of a photoelectric cell which rotates above her body. When light strikes the cell, driving and steering mechanism sends her hurrying towards it. If she brushes against any object in her path, contacts are operated that turn the steering away, and so automatically she takes avoiding action. Mrs. Walter's pet is Elmer, Elsie's brother, in the darker vest. He works in exactly the same way. Dr. Walter says that his electronic toys work exactly as though they have a simple two-cell nervous system, and that with more cells they will be able to do many more tricks. Already Elsie has one up on Elmer. When her batteries begin to fail, she automatically runs home to her kennel for charging up, and in consequence can live a much gayer life.
All right. I don't know. Pretty mind-blowing in my opinion. That something so advanced can be realized by fairly simple machine. So pretty cool stuff. So what we're going to do is sort of in that spirit, we're going to sort of try to do something very similar ourselves. We're going to try to understand what sort of sensory motor mappings would lead to some pretty interesting behaviors. All right. So instead of going all the way and creating, one of Gray Walter's tortoises, you certainly could try that if you like. We're going to try a little bit simpler problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what are called Bratenberg vehicles. So the idea of a Bratenberg vehicle was introduced by Valentino Bratenberg. So he was very interested in understanding sensory motor mappings and what kinds of interesting behaviors could be realized with these. So he was mostly interested in understanding whether you could build from a fairly simple sort of mapping and sort of make it more and more complex till at the end of this exercise, you got something that could exhibit things that people would ascribe intentionality or emotions to. So he was really interested in understanding the philosophy of mind and making statements about that. So understanding, what are sort of the minimal conditions necessary to exhibit intelligent behavior? Do we actually need these really complex sort of representations of the world around us, or can we get by with a relatively simple sensory motor mapping? Okay. So that's what he was mostly interested in. So he sort of articulated all these different sort of sensory motor mappings and what the sort of resultant behavior would be. He never really intended to build the robots, but there are people that have. So what we're going to do in this next exercise is actually watch a video of a group at MIT that built several of Bratenberg's vehicles, or I should say sort of programmed some of those vehicles. The robot you're going to see is the schematic is sort of shown here. So it's going to be a really simple robot. It's going to have what's called differential drive. So we're going to have two wheels, a left wheel and a right wheel. We can imagine commanding the velocities of each of the wheels. So for simplification, we'll think of it as sending a velocity signal, and the robot will sort of take care of achieving that velocity. We could also, we're going to add a bump sensor, one on the front, one on the back. And there's going to be a light sensor that you'll see in a couple of the videos. In some cases, it's mounted in the front. In some cases, mounted on the side. And then we also have this context sensor that looks kind of like a whisker that you'll see in some of the videos. We can imagine this just sort of turning on and off if it is in touch with something in the environment. All right, so let's go ahead and watch that video and you can see what I'm talking about. There's the light sensor right here. All right, and I've never bothered to figure out who this kid is at the end playing with that robot, but you know, that's part of the video. So that's there for you to check out as well. Anyway, so hopefully those were, you could see the sort of writing on each of those. You know, they had different sort of personalities sort of ascribed to each of these robots. And what we want you to do is sort of kind of reverse engineer what would be the sort of robot program that you would need in order to realize these various behaviors. All right, so let me walk you through an exercise that will give us some sense of how to think about that. So the first thing we need to understand in order to sort of design these sensory motor mappings is, well, how does a motor command, in this case, actually translate to some motion of the robot? All right, so we probably have a pretty good idea of what the sensors are. So we just talked about there's a bump sensor, there's a light sensor. We could go into those in more depth, but we also talked about the motor commands are sort of setting the left and right wheel velocity, but we don't have a sense of how those velocities actually translate into motion of the robot. All right, so in this case, we're going to go through a couple cases of different values for left and right wheel velocity, and try to understand what the resultant sort of motions of the robot would be in these cases. All right, so I'll just walk you through a couple of these and leave some of the other ones for you to do on your own. So the first problem is asking, what if the left velocity is positive and the right velocity is the negative of the left velocity? So they have the same magnitude, but they're going in different directions. So we can imagine the left wheel sort of pushing the robot forward and causing the robot to kind of rotate in a clockwise fashion if you're looking down at the robot from above. And then the right wheel is going to be rotating backwards because it's going to have a negative velocity, and it's going to sort of be also tending to sort of turn the robot around clockwise. So this robot would spin in the clockwise direction, again, if you're looking down at the robot, and it would spin in place, and that's because the velocities are equal and opposite. Similarly, if we had, for the second problem, we just had the reverse situation. Instead, we would have the robot spinning counterclockwise. So we're going to have the right wheel sort of pushing forward while the left wheel kind of tugs the robot back. For these other ones, we're going to explore what happens if we don't have the left and right wheel velocities have equal magnitude. So here we're going to say, what if the left wheel is stopped and the right wheel has a positive velocity? So hopefully you can see is that If the left wheel is not moving, the right wheel is moving, it's going to push the robot and sort of rotate it in a counterclockwise direction, but it's going to be rotating about the left wheel. All right, so the left wheel is going to be stationary, and we just sort of rotate around that. And then we'd have the reverse situation in the other case. Okay, so that's sort of the basic idea. Depending on how these sort of velocities, the relative magnitudes and their signs, you'll get different sort of directions of turning and different amounts of turning versus sort of linear motion. So I think you'll be able to think through that. The solutions are also down here if you want to take a look. Okay, all right, cool. So now we get to this idea of programming a robot on a Zoom whiteboard. So we used to do it on a whiteboard. You maybe want to do it on the Zoom whiteboard. We do have some suggestions for workflow that I'll mention in a second. All right, so let's go through one of these solutions here. So the idea is going to be, let's try to program one of these behaviors, okay? And then we're going to leave it up to you to program the rest of them. All right, so let me show you how we're imagining that going. All right, so here is a solution to the wary problem. All right, so in this case, the robot drives forward until it until it reads a light value that's sufficiently low. So it goes until it enters a dark area, then stops. All right, so this one is pretty simple. So I'll walk through the solution of this, and then we'll do one more together. All right, so the first thing I'd suggest doing in these problems is just coming up with a simple sketch of your robot and making sure you give sort of letters or symbols to each of the quantities you're talking about here. So here we have our left wheel and right wheel. So we have VL and VR for our left and right wheel velocity. And then we have a light sensor. We're going to use this script L to denote how much ambient light we're sensing. So high values of L would indicate lots of light sensed. And that light sensor is going to be right on the front of the robot.